7 sieges that nearly broke Christianity. The morning fog slowly lifted above the massive stone walls, while the sound of drums could already be heard in the distance. The besiegers had prepared their assault throughout the night, and now the moment had arrived when they would finally test the resolve of the city's defenders. In the history of the Middle Ages, there were 7 such sieges that sealed not just the fate of individual cities or fortresses, but threatened the future of the entire Christian world. These were not simple military clashes, but historical turning points where faith, courage, and the survival instinct collided with cruel reality. Today, I will guide you through those sieges that nearly broke Christianity, but ultimately brought the triumph of faith, or indeed, tragic defeat from which Europe recovered for centuries. The walls of Constantinople had stood unshakably for 1,523 years when the young Ottoman Sultan, who was barely 21 years old, decided to definitively close the chapter on the Byzantine Empire's history. The name of Sultan Mehmed II was later completed with the epithet, the Conqueror, and this title was born here, beneath the walls of Constantinople. The city, once founded by Constantine the Great, had been the eastern bastion of the Christian world for centuries. Its massive wall system, built and renovated over more than 1,000 years, had become legendary throughout Europe. The inner wall was 4 meters thick, the outer nearly 6 meters high, reinforced with towers. But Sultan Mehmed brought a new weapon, something the ancients had never seen: enormous cannons whose single projectile weighed more than 600 kilograms. The siege began in spring, when the Sultan gathered more than 70,000 men around the city. The sight of the Ottoman sea surging before the walls terrified the defenders, who knew they faced the superior force with merely 7,000 soldiers and several thousand civilians. Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese mercenary leader, took command of the defense, having gained experience in countless sieges in Italy and along the Mediterranean coast. Beside him stood the last Byzantine emperor, who was simply called Constantine, though his full name was Constantine XI Palaiologos. This emperor knew that the days of his reign were numbered, but he persevered because for him Constantinople was not simply a city, but the symbol of all Christian civilization. During the siege, the cannons thundered daily. The terribly large cannon created by a Hungarian engineer named Urban fired such massive balls that the ground trembled with each shot. The walls gradually crumbled, but the defenders went out every night and tried to repair the damage. The city's inhabitants used every stone, every beam to reinforce what could still stand. Women and children worked beside men because everyone knew, if the walls fall, no one will survive. Sultan Mehmed attacked the city not only on land, but also by sea. The Ottoman fleet, however, could not enter the Golden Horn Bay because the Byzantines had stretched a massive chain across the bay's entrance, which stopped the ships. The Sultan answered with a genius solution. He had the ships dragged overland across a hill, sliding them on beams with the help of grease, then launched them back into the water on the other side. The defenders watched in astonishment as the Ottoman fleet appeared in the bay, and suddenly they were attacked from all directions. The final assault came at the end of May. Sultan Mehmed launched continuous attacks for 3 days to exhaust the defenders. The first wave consisted of the so-called Bashibazouks, irregular, poorly equipped soldiers who were simply thrown in as sacrifices to wear down the defenders. The second wave was already the Anatolian regular troops, who fought much more organized. Finally came the elite Janissary unit, the Sultan's personal guard, which was famous for never retreating. Giovanni Giustiniani heroically led the defenders, but in one moment, a Turkish arrow pierced his breastplate. Severely wounded, he was carried from the battlefield, and when the defenders saw their commander had fallen, many lost their courage. In the final moments, Emperor Constantine removed his imperial insignia to fight as a simple soldier beside his men. The chronicles say his last words were, "The city has fallen, but I still live." Then he threw himself among the Janissaries and was never seen again. His body was never found, and thus the last Byzantine emperor became a legend who chose heroic death over humiliation. When the Turks finally broke into the city, 3 days of looting began, as Ottoman tradition required, but Sultan Mehmed, who considered himself the new Roman emperor, quickly ended the pillaging and began restoring the city. The fall of Constantinople was such a shocking event that all of Europe plunged into mourning. The Pope declared a new crusade, but no one answered the call. The Christian world had lost its eastern bastion, and this loss hurt for centuries. If you're interested in how the story continued and what became of Europe's fate afterward, stay with me, because now we come to another siege that was also nearly fatal for Christianity. The island of Rhodes was the last refuge of the Knights Hospitaller after they lost the Holy Land. In the year 1522, the Knights had held this strategically important island, lying in the middle of Ottoman sea routes, for nearly 200 years. The Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman I, later called the Magnificent, decided to definitively end the Hospitallers' rule. The island was surrounded by an enormous fleet. More than 400 ships anchored along the shores, and 100,000 soldiers landed for the siege. Grand Master Philippe de Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, who had already passed his 60th year, faced the Ottoman superior force with only 700 knights and slightly more than 6,000 local defenders. The Hospitallers, however, were experts in fortress defense, and the island's fortifications had been perfected over decades. The walls were thick, reinforced with deep moats and bastions that could withstand even the strongest cannon fire. The siege lasted 6 months, and every day was bloody. The Ottomans dug massive trenches to get closer to the walls, while the sky constantly thundered with the roar of cannons. The Hospitallers, however, made sorties at night, blew up Ottoman tunnels, and fought mercilessly for every inch of ground. An Italian engineer named Gabriele Tadini di Martinengo directed the technical part of the defense, building genius traps and defensive systems. One of the most critical moments came when the Ottomans finally successfully blew up part of the wall and made a huge breach in it. The Janissaries immediately launched an assault, certain of victory, but the Hospitallers had prepared for this. Behind the breach, they had built a second defensive line, and when the Janissaries poured in, they met with a rain of stones, boiling oil, and fiercely fighting knights. The battle was so cruel that the chronicles state the ground could not be seen beneath the corpses. Sultan Suleiman became increasingly desperate. He knew that if he failed to take Rhodes, his entire European expansion plan would be in jeopardy. He ordered more assaults, each bringing enormous casualties. The Ottoman cannons continuously bombarded the walls, and after a while it seemed that only ruins remained of the fortress. But the Hospitallers did not give up. Grand Master Philippe de l'Isle-Adam, however, was aware of reality. The number of defenders decreased day by day, and food was also running out. When not a single combat-ready knight remained without injury, the Grand Master made a heavy-hearted decision. He began negotiations with the Sultan. Suleiman, who admired the enemy's courage, offered surprisingly honorable terms. The knights could leave freely, take their treasures and weapons, and were given 18 days to evacuate the island. At year's end, the Hospitallers left Rhodes. The island's population watched with tears as the knights boarded ships. Grand Master Philippe looked around one last time at the final moment, then sailed away in silence. But this was not the end. The knights later found a new home in Malta, where they rebuilt their strength to continue the fight against the Ottomans. The siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade actually meant not one, but essentially 2 sieges. The first siege, from the Crusaders' perspective, began when they finally reached the Holy City. But before they arrived, the city had already been taken by the forces of the Egyptian Fatimid Caliph from the Seljuk Turks. So when the Crusaders got there, they had to face that the city was waiting for them in a newly reinforced position. The Crusader army arrived beneath the walls of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. After the long, exhausting campaign, barely 15,000 warriors remained alive from the originally nearly 30,000-strong army. Raymond de Saint-Gilles, Godfrey de Bouillon, and Tancred led the Crusader forces, but they knew that if they didn't take the city quickly, an Egyptian relief army would arrive. Governor Iftikhar ad-Dawla was aware of the situation and poisoned or destroyed every important water source around the city to make the besiegers' situation more difficult. The July heat was hellish. Many died of thirst in the Crusader camp because water was very far away. The city's walls were rock solid, and the defenders had abundant provisions. The Crusaders became desperate because they saw how time was working against them. Then came the news from the port of Jaffa that Genoese ships had arrived and brought the wood that could be used to build siege towers. The Crusaders fasted for 3 days and walked barefoot around the city walls, begging God for victory. The chaplain Arnulf of Malicorne preached to them, reminding them that Christ also suffered in this place, and now it was their turn to prove their faith. This spiritual preparation gave them new strength. In mid-July, the final assault began. Duke Godfrey and Tancred competed to be the first to reach the walls. The siege towers slowly rolled toward the walls, while the defenders bombarded them with flaming arrows and massive stones. But the Crusaders did not retreat. When finally one tower reached the wall and the bridge was lowered, Duke Godfrey jumped across first, followed by the vanguard of his knights. After the city's capture, according to the chronicles, such a massacre began that surpassed anything seen before. The Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir states that more than tens of thousands of people died, including women and children. The Jews hiding in synagogues were burned alive. The Crusaders believed themselves righteous because they thought they were fulfilling God's will, but the reality was that the horrors committed during the conquest poisoned Christian-Muslim relations for centuries. The siege of Antioch was one of the longest and most exhausting ordeals of the First Crusade. The city, which had once been one of the most important centers of the early Christian world, was already in Turkish hands at the time of the siege. Emir Yagisyan led the city, and although he did not have a very large garrison, the city's natural defensive conditions made it an almost impregnable fortress. The Crusaders arrived beneath the walls of Antioch in the autumn of 1098 and thought they would force the city to surrender within a few weeks. But they were wrong. The city walls were enormous, reinforced with more than 400 towers, and lay in such terrain that it was almost impossible to encircle them. The Crusader army thus found itself in a strange situation. They were the besiegers, but they soon realized that they themselves were also under siege because food began to run out and diseases decimated their ranks. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, walked around the camp every evening, reminding the knights of their original mission. But many lost faith. The winter was brutal, and many of the starving Crusaders died from cold and exhaustion. Stephen, Count of Blois, who was one of the wealthiest and most influential leaders of the campaign, one day secretly deserted and returned home to Europe, where he spread false news about the campaign's failure. Bohemond of Taranto, however, did not give up. He knew the city could not be taken by force, so he sought treachery. Eventually he met with an Armenian tower guard named Firuz, who was dissatisfied with Emir Yagisyan's rule. After lengthy negotiations, Firuz agreed to leave the gate of one tower open. On the agreed night, Bohemond's knights slipped into the city, and by dawn they were already inside the walls. The capture of the city, however, was only half a victory, because barely a few days later, the massive relief army of Emir Kerboga of Mosul arrived. Now the Crusaders were locked in the city with a superior enemy around them. Food ran out, and many already believed this was the end. A monk named Peter Bartholomew then came forward with the claim that in a vision he had found the holy lance with which Christ was pierced on the cross. This lance was allegedly dug up beneath a church floor. Many knights did not believe the story, but the news inflamed the credulous souls of the simple soldiers. They were filled with new courage because they felt that God was with them. At the June dawn, the Crusaders broke out of the city. At the head of the army, Bishop Adhemar carried the Holy Lance, and behind him surged the starved but determined Crusaders. Kerboga's army, which was much larger, was surprised by the sudden attack, and chroniclers later attributed it to angelic help that the Crusaders won. The reality was probably rather that Kerboga's army was not sufficiently cohesive and fell apart due to internal tensions when unexpectedly attacked. After the capture of Antioch, Bohemond essentially founded his own principality here, not caring that he had originally promised to return the city to the Byzantine emperor. This decision brought deep rifts between the Crusaders and the Byzantines. The siege of Acre was the longest and bloodiest siege of the Third Crusade. The city was a strategic key point because pilgrims landed here, and from here began the defensive system of the coastal strip under Christian rule. When Saladin captured Jerusalem and gradually recaptured the other Crusader cities, Acre became the next target. Guy de Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, who had recently been released from Saladin's captivity, decided to recapture Acre before help arrived from Europe. King Guy arrived beneath the walls of Acre with barely a few thousand men, facing the well-defended, fortified city. Saladin immediately reacted and surrounded Guy's army, so the situation again became one where the besiegers themselves were besieged. The Crusader camp lived in terrible conditions, diseases raged, and many died of starvation. But soon the first ships arrived from Europe with fresh soldiers and food. The siege lasted nearly 2 years. The summer of 1991 was hot, and both sides suffered. Saladin tried several times to relieve the city, but the Crusader forces stubbornly persevered. Meanwhile, French King Philip II Augustus and English King Richard I also arrived, although Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa had already died on the way, drowned in a river. King Richard immediately took command of operations. He had new siege engines built and increased the pressure on the city. The defenders could barely resist any longer, and finally in mid-July, they surrendered. According to the agreement, the city was handed over in exchange for the defenders being allowed to leave freely if Saladin paid the ransom. But King Richard was an impatient man. When Saladin delayed in paying the ransom, Richard gave the order to execute the prisoners. Nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners were massacred beneath the city walls in Richard's personal presence. This cruel act stirred deep hatred, and Saladin in revenge had Christian prisoners killed. This ended all hope for a peaceful agreement, and the war continued. The siege of Nicopolis was a tragic event that showed how divided and unprepared the Christian world was in the face of the Ottoman threat. In the year 1396, at the call of Hungarian King Sigismund I, an international Crusader army gathered to stop the European advance of Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I. Among the army's members were French, Burgundians, English, Germans, and Hungarians, but unity existed only on the surface. The Crusader army set out down the Danube and first besieged Nicopolis, which was in Ottoman hands. But the siege had barely properly begun when news came that Sultan Bayezid was approaching with an enormous army. The Crusader commanders began to deliberate but could not agree. The arrogance of the French knights clashed with the sober judgment of the Hungarians. Jean de Nevers, the Burgundian count, led the French contingent and demanded that the French knights be in the first line because this was their due. King Sigismund tried in vain to explain that the Ottomans' way of fighting was different from what they were used to and that a hasty attack must be avoided. But the French knights did not listen, saying the Hungarians were cowards and they would show how to fight. The battle began in the morning when the French knights, without waiting for the other units to line up, charged at the Ottoman lines. At first, they were successful because the light infantry in the first line fled before them. But it was a trap. As the knights penetrated deeper, they suddenly found themselves face to face with the dense ranks of Janissaries and Bayezid's reserve cavalry. They were surrounded and slaughtered. King Sigismund tried to organize the Hungarian troops, but it was already too late. The Crusader army fell apart, and a retreat began. Thousands died in the battle, and even more were taken prisoner. Of the French knights, they kept alive only those for whom they hoped to get ransom. Jean de Nevers also fell into captivity and was released only after years for a huge ransom. The fall of Nicopolis showed that the medieval chivalric culture, which emphasized personal bravery and honorable combat, was no longer enough against the well-organized, disciplined force of the Ottoman army. Another siege of Constantinople was actually another test of the same city we already talked about, but for the medieval person, it was a final reckoning between the Christian world and Islamic expansion. The details of the siege are already known, But what is perhaps not yet sufficiently emphasized is the depth of the human dramas that unfolded inside and outside the walls. The people participating in the defense knew that if the city fell, not just a city would fall, but an entire civilization. Constantinople preserved more than 1,000 years of traditions, libraries that guarded the knowledge of the ancient world, and a Christian community that descended in direct line from the time of the apostles. In the final days, people prayed in the churches, wept, and tried to understand how history could have turned this way. On the Ottoman army's side stood a young sultan who wanted to prove he was worthy to be the heir of his great predecessors. The conquest of Constantinople was Sultan Mehmed's dream, and when it finally happened, he felt he had fulfilled his destiny. After conquering the city, he quickly restored it and made it a new capital, which became known by the name Istanbul. The siege of Vienna in the year 1683 was the last great test of Christian Europe in the face of Ottoman conquest. An enormous Ottoman army led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa arrived along the Danube and surrounded Vienna. The city's fate seemed uncertain because the defenders were few and help had to come from far away. Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg led the city's defense and used every day to strengthen the walls and prepare the population for the siege. In the summer heat, the defenders knew that the Ottomans were getting closer every day, digging tunnels, and if they once blew up the walls, it would all be over. During the siege, the Ottomans bombarded the city walls with enormous cannons and managed to breach several places. But the defenders repaired the damage every night and persevered. The women and children of the city's inhabitants also helped, carrying stone, water, and nursing the wounded. When finally the relief army led by Polish King John III Sobieski arrived, the city was already on the brink of collapse. The Battle of Kahlenberg, which took place in mid-September, brought such a great Christian victory that it definitively stopped Ottoman expansion in Europe. Sobieski's famous hussar, who with their winged armor provided a terrifying sight, broke the Ottoman lines, and Kara Mustafa was forced to flee. After the victory, all of Europe breathed a sigh of relief. The salvation of Vienna was not just the salvation of a city, but the survival of a civilization. The Ottomans never again came so close to the heart of Western Europe, and from then on the Christian world began to push them back. These sieges were not just military events, but human dramas that showed what people are willing to sacrifice for their faith, homeland, and what they hold sacred. Behind the walls, women and children were afraid, while outside men fought for their lives. And in these sieges, not only weapons clashed, but cultures, religions, and worldviews. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darkest and bloodiest sieges of the Middle Ages, please share this video with those who also love history. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts, where we'll continue the stories of the Crusades and the Ottoman Wars. And hit the like button if you feel it was worth following these dramatic events. See you in the next video, where we'll talk about the secrets of the knightly orders and the hidden stories of medieval castles. Thank you for being with me.